May 15th, 1943. Mid-Atlantic, approximately 600 miles west of the Azores. A merchant hull conversion plowed through heavy seas at 18 knots, painfully slow by warship standards. USS Bobe, CVE-9, one of America's new escort carriers, looked nothing like the mighty fleet carriers that dominated naval warfare imagery. No towering island superstructure, no sleek lines suggesting speed and power, just a boxy, utilitarian flight deck mounted atop what was obviously a converted cargo ship hull. Her crew called her a jeep carrier. British sailors called similar ships Woolworth carriers, cheap and cheerful, built on a budget. The designation CVE inspired darker nicknames among the men who sailed them: combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. Some called them Kaiser coffins, after Henry J. Kaiser, whose shipyards mass-produced them with assembly line efficiency. German U-boat commanders, monitoring Allied radio traffic and observing these ungainly vessels through periscopes, dismissed them contemptuously. Intelligence reports described them as Behelfsträger, makeshift carriers, slow, lightly armed, built on merchant hulls. They couldn't keep up with fleet task forces. They carried only 24 aircraft compared to the 90 embarked on proper fleet carriers. Their thin hulls offered minimal protection against torpedoes. To experienced U-boat aces who had sent hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom, these improvised warships represented no serious threat. They were targets of opportunity, not hunters to be feared. The U-boat commanders were catastrophically wrong. Over the next 2 years, escort carriers and their destroyer escorts would systematically hunt German submarines to near extinction. They would close the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had slaughtered convoys beyond reach of land-based aircraft. They would sink over 50 U-boats through aggressive hunter-killer operations that turned the hunted into hunters. They would help transform the Battle of the Atlantic from a desperate defensive struggle into an offensive campaign that strangled Germany's submarine arm. The cheap, slow, vulnerable jeep carriers would prove more decisively effective against U-boats than any other weapon system deployed in the Atlantic. This is the story of how American industrial ingenuity, operational innovation, and sheer determination turned merchant hulls into submarine killers, and how the weapon everyone dismissed changed the course of history's longest continuous military campaign.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the only campaign that truly frightened Winston Churchill. Britain's survival depended entirely on sea lanes connecting North America to Europe. If German U-boats severed those supply lines, Britain would starve, her war industries would cease, and invasion would become inevitable. By early 1942, Germany was winning. Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat fleet had grown from fewer than 50 boats in 1939 to over 300 operational submarines. His Wolfpack tactics, coordinated group attacks on convoys, proved devastatingly effective. U-boats would shadow convoys beyond range of escort vessel sensors, radio positions to headquarters, and assemble in packs of 10 to 20 submarines. When night fell, they would attack on the surface from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming defensive screens. The statistics told a grim story. In 1942, U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships, totaling over 7.7 million tons, more tonnage than Allied shipyards could replace. Merchant mariners faced casualty rates exceeding those of any other Allied service. The odds of surviving multiple Atlantic crossings approached those of surviving bomber missions over Germany. The problem was the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap beyond range of land-based aircraft operating from Canada, Iceland, or Britain. Convoys sailing through this gap had no air cover for 7 to 10 days. U-boats gathered there like predators at a watering hole, knowing convoys were defenseless against surface attacks. British escort carriers provided partial solutions. HMS Audacity, converted from a captured German merchant ship, demonstrated that even a small carrier could dramatically reduce U-boat effectiveness. Her Martlet fighters drove away Focke-Wulf Condor reconnaissance aircraft that shadowed convoys and forced U-boats to dive, reducing their mobility and effectiveness. But Audacity was sunk in December 1941. Britain couldn't produce enough carriers to protect every convoy. Shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity building destroyers, corvettes, and essential merchant ships. America would have to solve the crisis through industrial capacity, building carriers in quantities that made quality secondary to availability.
The escort carrier program began not from military planning, but from presidential directive. In December 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the Navy to convert merchant ships into auxiliary aircraft carriers for convoy protection. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark and Navy Secretary Frank Knox opposed the idea, believing advances in aircraft technology made such carriers impractical. Roosevelt overruled them. He understood industrial capacity's strategic value. America couldn't build fleet carriers quickly. They required years of specialized construction. But merchant hulls? American shipyards were producing those by the hundreds. The Maritime Commission released C-3 freighter hulls, diesel-powered cargo ships with good speed and seaworthiness for conversion. The first, USS Long Island, AVG-1, commissioned on June 2, 1941. Built in less than 3 months at Newport News Shipbuilding, she cost $1.5 million, roughly 1/6 the cost of a fleet carrier. Long Island proved the concept worked. A merchant hull could support a functional flight deck. Aircraft could operate from the short deck using catapults and arresting gear. The ship could maintain convoy speeds and operate in Atlantic weather. But one carrier couldn't protect hundreds of convoys. Roosevelt demanded a crash program. Dozens of carriers, built quickly using standardized designs that any shipyard could construct. The Navy developed specifications for what would become the Bogue-class escort carrier. Based on C-3 hulls with steam turbine propulsion, these ships displaced approximately 15,000 tons fully loaded, measured 495 feet long, and could achieve 19 knots maximum speed. They carried 24 to 36 aircraft, typically 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and 12 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The specifications prioritized mass production over performance. No armor belt, minimal defensive armament, commercial-grade steel wherever possible, simple propulsion systems, standardized components that multiple suppliers could produce. Everything designed for rapid construction and easy maintenance. By 1942, 4 shipyards were producing escort carriers: Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation, Western Pipe and Steel Company, Ingalls Shipbuilding, and most prolifically, Henry J. Kaiser's Vancouver Yard. Kaiser revolutionized shipbuilding through prefabrication and assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing. His yards could complete an escort carrier in 3 months compared to 2 years for fleet carriers. The Casablanca-class CVEs, Kaiser's masterpiece, were built in such quantities that 50 launched between July 1943 and July 1944, 1 carrier every 7 days. By war's end, American yards had produced 122 escort carriers of 151 total carriers built. Over 80% of American carrier strength consisted of these cheap and cheerful conversions and purpose-built auxiliaries. 45 served with the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease.
The program cost relatively little compared to other naval construction. A Casablanca-class CVE cost approximately $6.5 million versus $68 million for an Essex-class fleet carrier. For the price of one fleet carrier, America could build 10 escort carriers. German U-boat commanders, monitoring this massive production effort through intelligence reports, dismissed it as American industrial excess building inferior ships. They understood that slow, lightly armed carriers couldn't operate with fleet task forces. They failed to understand these carriers weren't designed for fleet operations. They were designed specifically to hunt U-boats.
The escort carrier's striking power came from its aircraft, specifically the Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber configured for anti-submarine warfare. The Avenger was a large, rugged aircraft with remarkable capabilities for its era. It carried internal bomb bays that could accommodate depth charges, acoustic homing torpedoes, or bombs. External hardpoints allowed additional ordnance. The aircraft had excellent range, over 1,000 miles, allowing it to patrol vast ocean areas searching for surfaced U-boats. But the real revolution was the Mark 24 mine, officially designated as a mine to maintain secrecy, but actually an acoustic homing torpedo nicknamed Fido. Developed in utmost secrecy at Bell Telephone Laboratories and Harvard University's Underwater Sound Laboratory, Fido was the world's first practical passive acoustic homing torpedo. Dropped from aircraft by parachute, it would enter the water, activate its acoustic sensors, detect the noise signature of submarine propellers, and home on that sound until impact. The warhead, 96 pounds of Torpex explosive, could break a U-boat's pressure hull with a single hit. Fido's existence remains so closely guarded that many American pilots didn't know what it was. They were simply told to drop the weapon and leave the area quickly. German U-boat crews never understood why aircraft attacks suddenly became so deadly in 1943. They knew aircraft were dropping something into the water, but couldn't comprehend how these weapons could track submarines through precise course changes and evasive maneuvers. The answer was invisible sound. Fido listened for propeller noise and followed it relentlessly. Once dropped near a U-boat, escape was nearly impossible. The torpedo was faster underwater than any submarine. It didn't care about evasive maneuvers, it simply followed the noise. The only effective countermeasure was shutting down engines and drifting silently, but that made the submarine helpless against follow-up attacks from surface escorts. Escort carriers also deployed F-4F Wildcat fighters for a different purpose: attacking surfaced U-boats with machine guns and rockets. U-boats spent most of their time on the surface, where diesel engines could recharge batteries and provide maximum speed and maneuverability. Wildcat strafing runs forced them to dive, rendering them slow, nearly blind, and vulnerable to depth charges from destroyer escorts. The combination proved lethal. Wildcats forced U-boats underwater, Avengers dropped Fido on the submerged boats, and if submarines somehow survived, destroyer escorts finished them with depth charges and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars.
Early escort carriers operated defensively, staying with convoys to provide air cover against U-boat attacks. This reduced losses but didn't eliminate the threat. Submarines could still shadow convoys and call wolf packs. Then, American naval strategists developed a revolutionary concept, the hunter-killer group. Instead of waiting for U-boats to attack convoys, why not hunt them proactively? Form independent task groups centered on escort carriers, give them freedom to roam the Atlantic searching for submarines, and coordinate operations using ultra-intelligence, Allied codebreakers' ability to read German radio communications. The first hunter-killer group formed around USS Bogue in May 1943. The task group consisted of Bogue and 4 destroyer escorts: USS George E. Badger, USS Osmond Ingram, USS Green, and USS Leah. Their mission? Patrol areas where ultra-intelligence indicated U-boat concentrations and sink every submarine they found. Captain Giles Short commanded Bogue with aggressive determination. He understood that his slow, vulnerable carrier was actually perfectly suited for anti-submarine warfare. Fleet carriers were too valuable to risk in prolonged submarine hunts. His CVE was expendable enough to operate in danger zones for weeks at a time. On May 22, 1943, Bogue's Avengers caught U-569 on the surface refueling from a supply submarine. The Avengers attacked immediately, dropping depth charges that forced U-569 to crash dive. The submarine's captain, attempting evasive maneuvers, dove too deep. The pressure hull imploded, killing all hands. The hunter-killer tactics proved devastatingly effective. Bogue's task group sank 9 U-boats in 7 months, an extraordinary kill rate considering most convoy escorts considered themselves successful if they drove submarines away without sinking them. USS Card, commanded by Captain Arnold J. Buster Ishbel, refined the tactics further. Ishbel pioneered night operations, using Avengers equipped with radar and searchlights to catch surfaced U-boats after dark, the period when submarines felt safest and operated most brazenly. On August 27, 1943, Card's aircraft detected U-847 on the surface at night. The U-boat's lookouts never saw the approaching Avenger. The first indication of attack was depth charges exploding alongside the hull. U-847 sank with all hands. Card's task group sank 8 U-boats and earned a Presidential Unit Citation, the Navy's highest unit decoration. Ishbel's aggressive tactics became doctrine for all hunter-killer groups. By the end of 1943, 10 escort carriers operated in the Atlantic exclusively as submarine hunters. Their task groups roamed independently, responding to ultra-intelligence reports of U-boat positions, concentrating forces wherever submarines gathered, and systematically destroying Donitz's underwater fleet. The statistics told the story of transformation. In May 1943, Black May, as German submariners called it, Allied forces sank 41 U-boats, more than in any previous month. Escort carrier task groups accounted for a significant portion of those kills. The Battle of the Atlantic's tide had turned irreversibly.
The escort carrier's effectiveness multiplied through integration with Allied intelligence systems that U-boat commanders never suspected. Ultra-intelligence. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had broken German Enigma codes, allowing Allies to read U-boat radio communications almost in real time. Every position report, every order from U-boat headquarters, every tactical communication between submarines was intercepted, decoded, and analyzed. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, was so valuable that Churchill personally ordered its protection at all costs. When Ultra revealed U-boat positions, hunter-killer groups would be vectored toward those areas. But operational plans had to provide cover stories that wouldn't reveal Allied code-breaking capabilities. The solution was high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, pronounced HFDF. This radio direction finding system allowed ships to determine the bearing of radio transmissions. When U-boats transmitted position reports, HFDF equipment on escort carriers and destroyers would pinpoint their location to within a few miles. From German perspective, Allied ships seemed to possess supernatural abilities to locate submarines. U-boats would surface to transmit brief messages, sometimes lasting only seconds, and within hours, aircraft would appear overhead. The Germans never understood that Ultra had already revealed their positions, and HFDF provided tactical precision for immediate attacks. USS Guadalcanal, commanded by Captain Daniel V. Gallery, exploited this intelligence integration brilliantly. Gallery's task group 22.3, sank 3 U-boats using ultra-directed searches. But Gallery wanted something more ambitious, capturing a U-boat intact with all codebooks and equipment.
June 4, 1944. Approximately 150 miles off Cape Blanco, French West Africa. USS Guadalcanal's sonar operators detected a submerged contact. Destroyer escorts, USS Chatelain and USS Pillsbury, prosecuted with depth charges, forcing the submarine to surface. U-505 broke the surface in desperation, her pressure hull damaged, crew abandoning ship through conning tower hatches. Captain Gallery had prepared his task group extensively for this moment. Weeks earlier, he'd ordered every ship to develop boarding party plans for capturing a U-boat. His crews had trained repeatedly, though most considered it fantasy. U-boat crews were trained to scuttle their boats to prevent capture. But U-505's crew, disoriented from depth-charge concussions and terrified of continued attacks, abandoned ship without properly setting demolition charges. Water flooded through open hatches, but the hull remained intact. Lieutenant Albert David from USS Pillsbury led a boarding party, a volunteer crew of 9 sailors who crossed to the sinking submarine in a whaleboat while shells from American destroyers splashed around them, targeting U-505's deck guns to prevent German crew from returning. David's party entered the U-boat through the conning tower, finding the interior flooded and tilting as the boat slowly sank. Working in near darkness with water rising around them, the boarding party closed valves, stopped flooding, and secured the submarine. What they found revolutionized Allied anti-submarine warfare. Complete Enigma machines with current rotor settings. Codebooks showing the daily code tables for the next 2 months. Technical manuals describing German acoustic torpedoes. Intelligence documents revealing U-boat tactics, patrol areas, and operational procedures. The intelligence bonanza was so valuable that the entire operation was classified at the highest levels. U-505's capture was hidden from public knowledge. The submarine was towed to Bermuda, then to the United States for extensive technical evaluation. German authorities were allowed to believe U-505 had sunk with all hands. The captured codebooks allowed Allied cryptanalysts to read German submarine communications with even greater reliability. More importantly, the technical intelligence revealed German torpedo technology and countermeasures, allowing development of better defensive tactics. U-505 survived the war and is currently displayed at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, the only German U-boat in the United States and only the second enemy warship captured by U.S. forces since the War of 1812. But beyond the intelligence value, the capture demonstrated that escort carriers could conduct operations of extraordinary complexity and daring. Gallery's task group hadn't just sunk U-boats, they'd captured one intact through careful planning, aggressive leadership, and skilled execution. By mid-1943, escort carriers had fundamentally transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from defensive convoy protection to offensive submarine hunting. The statistics from May 1943 reveal the magnitude of transformation. 41 U-boats sunk in a single month, more than Germany could replace through new construction. 15 U-boats sunk by aircraft, many from escort carriers. 114 U-boats lost in the first 5 months of 1943. 62 consecutive Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic without losing a single ship. Admiral Donitz withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic in May 1943, privately acknowledging he had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. In his war diary, he wrote, "The enemy has succeeded in gaining the advantage in submarine defense. The enemy knows all our secrets, and we know none of his." He was more correct than he realized. Ultra-intelligence, escort carrier hunter-killer groups, improved radar, and acoustic homing torpedoes had created an operational environment where U-boats couldn't survive. USS Core sank 6 U-boats in 4 months. USS Card sank 8. USS Bogue's total reached 9. USS Croatan sank 7. USS Block Island sank 4 before being torpedoed herself, the only U.S. carrier lost in the Atlantic. The Casablanca-class carriers joining the fleet in late 1943 maintained the pressure. USS Guadalcanal sank 3 beyond her capture of U-505. USS Mission Bay, USS Solomons, and USS Wake Island all added to the carnage. A typical hunter-killer patrol lasted 30 to 40 days. The task group would patrol areas indicated by ultra-intelligence, flying continuous searches day and night. When aircraft detected a U-boat, they would attack immediately while vectoring surface escorts to the contact. U-boats attempting to escape on the surface would be strafed by Wildcats. Those diving would be depth-charged by Avengers. If they survived initial air attacks, destroyer escorts would prosecute with Hedgehog mortars and depth charges. The hunter-killer groups gave U-boats no respite, no safe areas, no opportunity to recharge batteries or surface safely. German submariners began calling the mid-Atlantic the Tal der Tränen, Valley of Tears. Areas that had been hunting grounds became death traps. The Black Pit had become a graveyard.
The nickname combustible, vulnerable, and expendable wasn't entirely unjust. Escort carriers were indeed vulnerable. Thin hulls, minimal armor, limited defensive armament, and massive aviation fuel tanks made them susceptible to catastrophic damage. 7 U.S. escort carriers were lost during World War II, more than any other American carrier type. USS Block Island was torpedoed by U-549 on May 29, 1944, off the Canary Islands. 2 torpedoes struck her starboard side, causing massive flooding. The carrier sank in 6 hours. 6 crewmen died, 951 were rescued by destroyer escorts. U-549 was sunk hours later by USS Eugene E. Elmore using Hedgehog mortars. USS Liscum Bay was torpedoed by Japanese submarine I-175 during the Gilbert Islands campaign. A single torpedo struck the carrier's bomb magazine, causing a catastrophic explosion that killed 644 men, including Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullenix. Only 272 survived. 3 escort carriers, USS St. Lo, USS Omani Bay, and USS Bismarck Sea, were destroyed by Japanese kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. St. Lo became the first major warship sunk by kamikaze when a Mitsubishi A6M0 crashed into her flight deck during the battle off Samar, detonating bombs and torpedoes in the hangar deck. The vulnerability statistics were sobering. Of 122 U.S. escort carriers built, 7 were sunk, a loss rate of 5.7%. For comparison, fleet carriers had a loss rate of approximately 4%. Escort carriers were indeed more vulnerable. But the losses, while tragic, were operationally acceptable. The strategic return, 53 U-boats sunk by Atlantic CVE task groups alone, far exceeded the cost of replacing lost carriers. And American industrial capacity could replace escort carriers in months, while U-boats took longer to build and required irreplaceable trained crews. HMS Avenger was sunk by U-155 with massive loss of life, only 12 survivors from 524 aboard. HMS Dasher exploded in the Firth of Clyde from undetermined causes, killing 379 men. The British also learned escort carriers could die quickly and violently. But they kept building them. The operational value exceeded the risk.
As long as industrial capacity could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them, the exchange favored allies. By 1944, U-boats were losing the war catastrophically. Escort carrier hunter-killer groups, improved radar, acoustic homing torpedoes, and systematic ultra-intelligence had created an environment where submarine operations approached suicide. German submarines that had once terrorized Atlantic convoys now survived measured in weeks rather than months. New U-boat crews sailed from French bases with life expectancies shorter than bomber crews over Germany. Experienced commanders who had survived the early war years were dead or captured. Replacement crews were poorly trained and terrified. Admiral Donitz continued operations despite the impossible odds. He ordered development of revolutionary submarine technologies, the Type 21 electroboat, with underwater speeds exceeding 20 knots, snorkel systems allowing diesel operation while submerged, and advanced acoustic torpedoes. But these weapons arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. The escort carriers maintained relentless pressure. In 1944, CVE task groups sank 28 U-boats. In early 1945, they sank another 6 before Germany's collapse in May. The final U-boat sunk by an escort carrier aircraft was U-1231, destroyed on April 13, 1945, by aircraft from USS Croatan, less than a month before Germany's surrender. When the war ended, Germany's U-boat fleet was shattered. Of approximately 1,100 U-boats commissioned during the war, 783 were lost, a catastrophic 71% loss rate. Over 28,000 German submariners died, 3/4 of all men who served in U-boats. Escort carrier task groups accounted for 53 confirmed U-boat kills, roughly 7% of all German submarine losses. But their impact far exceeded raw kill numbers. By closing the Black Pit, forcing submarines to operate submerged and vulnerable, and creating an operational environment where surfacing meant near certain death, escort carriers helped transform the Battle of the Atlantic from desperate defense to systematic destruction. In October 1944, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, wrote, "The CVE support groups accounted for about 60% of all U-boats sunk by U.S. forces in the Atlantic and Mediterranean during the 6 months April through September 1944. The cheap, slow, vulnerable jeep carriers had become the most effective submarine killers in the Atlantic."
German U-boat commanders who dismissed escort carriers as makeshift vessels learned the hardest lesson in military history. Underestimate your enemy's industrial capacity at your peril. The CVE program demonstrated principles that remain relevant today. Mass production beats elite quality. Germany built sophisticated submarines with advanced technology. America built enough escort carriers to hunt them systematically. Quantity has a quality all its own. Mission-specific design works. Escort carriers weren't trying to be fleet carriers. They were designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare and convoy protection. This focus made them extraordinarily effective at their intended mission. Industrial capacity is strategic weapon. Building 122 escort carriers in 3 years demonstrated American industrial might that Germany simply couldn't match. The ability to replace losses quickly meant temporary setbacks didn't matter strategically. Innovation multiplies effect. Escort carriers integrated acoustic homing torpedoes, ultra-intelligence, HFDF, and improved radar into hunter-killer tactics that made them far more effective than their modest specifications suggested. Underestimating opponents is fatal.
German commanders who laughed at jeep carriers paid with their lives and their submarines. The makeshift vessels proved decisively lethal. After World War II, several escort carriers continued serving in new roles. Some became helicopter carriers. Others served as aircraft transports during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The final CVE wasn't scrapped until 1970, the last survivor of a class that changed naval warfare. Sadly, no escort carrier was preserved. These ships that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic were all scrapped. The only physical reminders are museum displays, photographs, and the memories of aging veterans who served aboard them. But their legacy endures. In every lesson, military planners learn about the relationship between industrial capacity, mission-focused design, and operational effectiveness. The U-boat commanders stopped laughing sometime in 1943. By then, it was far too late. The cheap, slow, vulnerable escort carriers were systematically hunting them to extinction. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not by the most powerful weapons, but by the most numerous, the most persistent, and the most effectively employed. America built 122 escort carriers. They sank over 50 U-boats directly and contributed to the destruction of hundreds more by closing the Black Pit and forcing submarines into environments where other weapons could kill them. The jeep carriers proved that in modern war, the side that can mass-produce effective weapons and employ them aggressively wins. Engineering excellence and sophisticated technology matter less than industrial capacity and operational innovation. Germany learned that lesson through thousands of drowned submariners and hundreds of destroyed U-boats. America demonstrated it through merchant hulls transformed into submarine killers, cheap, cheerful, and devastatingly effective. The commanders who laughed at escort carriers never lived to acknowledge their mistake. They died in the Atlantic depths, hunted by the ungainly warships they'd dismissed as makeshift.
In memory of the 28,000 German submariners and 30,000 Allied merchant mariners who died in the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, decided ultimately not by heroism or technology alone, but by industrial capacity and operational persistence.